Yo, so guys, welcome back to another video. This is a reaction to Atlas Pro. I reacted to this channel before. It was the herbs. It was the video to like herbs or like food tastes around the world. It's a really interesting video. I really enjoyed it, and under that video I had suggestions for this one. I was planning to do this one a lot sooner, and I guess as usual I just sort of forgot about it, and then I just obviously now I've remembered it. It sort of popped up and it sort of clicked in my head. Oh, I was going to react to this before, and it's here. But yeah, the video is the problem with the USA's borders, and I'm going to react to this in two parts, so like probably split it in half. One will be posted now, one will be posted like an hour or two after. I'm going to react to it straight after, but just know if you if you watch this reaction and you see, oh, you've only seen half, the reaction will be up, or should be up, within the next few minutes. But yeah, I do like this channel from what I've seen of it. I don't know much about it, but from what I've seen I like it, and I mean, yeah, this is suggested quite a lot. So I mean, let's just get into this. There's nothing else really to say, but before we do, quick shout out to my Instagram, my Twitter, links in the description for those interested. Same for my Patreon, links are there for those interested. But yeah, man, let's just get into this one. Let's see what this video has to say.
On December 7th, 1787, Delaware ratified the newly written United States Constitution, becoming the first state to enter into the Union. Over the next 2 years, 12 states did the very same thing, totaling 13 original states by 1790. Just a year later, Vermont was added as the first new addition to the country and the 14th member of the Union. A year after that, it was Kentucky, then Tennessee, then Ohio by 1803. This year, however, saw the purchase of the Louisiana Territory from France, doubling the size of the country and jump-starting a new age of American expansion. Starting in 1812 with the addition of Louisiana, over the next 100 years, the country added a total of 31 states, averaging one new state every 3 years, until the country assumed its final contiguous form in 1912, with the admission of Arizona as the 48th state. And just like that, there was no more space for the country to grow. It wouldn't be for 47 years that another change came to the American map, when in 1959 Alaska was annexed as the 49th state, and less than 9 months later Hawaii became the 50th and final state to be admitted to the Union. Now it's been 62 years since any change to the American map has occurred, by far the longest period in the country's history. While this very well might change in the upcoming years as the case for both Puerto Rican and DC statehood gather momentum, what's clear is that America is no longer the...
So I have seen that mentioned before in like videos. I think it was like the food inside of videos. It always sort of brought up them at the end. But I didn't realise it was actually a real possibility. I mean, I knew it was a possibility, but I didn't know it was like picking up steam. It's one of those things that's actually like being pushed for, kind of thing.
Dynamic country it once was, and virtually all progress in developing the country's borders has ended. Of course, in a lot of ways, this makes sense. The United States' era of expansion is over, and now all the land on the continent is claimed by someone. But now that we've been stuck with the same borders for over a century, a new possibility has opened up. Instead of looking outside of our borders for ways to expand, we can finally bring our attention back to the lines that actually define the inside of the country, and use what we know now about how America and its states work together to improve its overall ability to function. After all, with a new state added every 3 years, not a lot of thought was put into these borders and how they'd come to impact the states they defined. Instead of taking into account the landscape and natural barriers, many states resorted to cutting up territories with straight and uncompromising borders, often to their own detriment, and left plenty of room for improvement. It might be time for the US to reassess its own internal divides and begin a new era, not of expansion, but rather optimization.
Fuck me, yalla.
Now, I know what a lot of you are thinking already. What's wrong with the borders we already have? And okay, I'll be honest, a very strong argument could be made to keep everything how it is. Seeing how successful the country as a whole has been over the past 100 years, what need is there to change, right? To this, I'd say that while yes, the USA has accomplished a lot, not all states were created equal. And so, while some have risen to become remarkable contributors to the country, a lot of states have been left behind, doomed by their own geography and the thoughtless borders that encompass them. To understand what I mean, I'd like to walk us through 3 examples where states have suffered as a direct result of their haphazard creation.
West Virginia.
Since its separation from Virginia in 1863, West Virginia has occupied one of the poorest and most underdeveloped corners in the entire country. The state ranks 50th out of 50, or dead last, in terms of median household income, 49th in per capita income, 44th in overall poverty rate, 50th in life expectancy, 50th in college education. I could keep going, but what's clear is that no matter what metric is used, West Virginia always seems to find its way towards the bottom of the list, and we don't need to look any further than the state's geography to understand why. Nestled entirely within the Appalachian Mountains, there's no flat land for farming, no easy way to transport materials in and out for manufacturing, nowhere to develop large cities, and no easy way for people just arriving in the country to move here. The only thing West Virginia is good for is coal mining, which has been the primary driver of its economy for its entire history. Except now, with the coal industry in decline, people are destined to leave, as opportunities for employment often follow where large numbers of people can be located. Without any other large industry to fall back on, the state is essentially powerless to prevent its population from jumping ship and has little to offer to attract new people. By trapping West Virginia solely within the confines of the Appalachians, the state simply lacks many of the necessary qualities that make...
I mean, it looks beautiful, but again, that's not what this is about. It's about certain things, certain opportunities, the land that it's on, like everything about it. They've just been given a situation that they can't, or the state, the people of the state have been put in a situation that they can't help. It's just the geography of the land and all these different things. There's not the ability to build cities, like he's saying. All these different opportunities are gone. So I mean, goddamn, maybe in 50 years time, 100 years time, this will be this isn't the least populated state, but maybe by then it could be, or it'll be one of the most least populated states, because obviously people are moving away looking for different opportunities and jobs, etc. But I wouldn't have guessed this, I'm not even going to lie.
Sufficiency. And if I'm to be honest, the state might be better off as, well, not a state, but rather the more rural part of a larger, more diversified state. While the obvious choice might be to recombine with Virginia, with the Appalachians clearly severing this area from the East Coast, it might actually be a better idea to merge with Ohio or Kentucky, as that would allow much easier access through their shared rivers, gaining entry to the Great Lakes or Mississippi River, and give people who want to leave the harsh mountains a place to move to while staying within the state. In the end, while it's easy to blame West Virginia for its own shortfalls, it's important to remember the state's borders were drawn not as the result of settlement patterns or careful planning, but rather in a rushed move to break away from a Virginia that was trying to secede as part of the Confederacy. West Virginians' choice to remain loyal to the Union at all costs shouldn't mean condemning them to a state destined to fail.
Nevada.
Moving over west, we'll come to the state of Nevada. While the economic situation here isn't nearly as bad as that in West Virginia, Nevada suffers from its own problems with geography, or more specifically, topography. You see, in most places around the world, rivers flow from mountains to the coast. Together with a river's many tributaries, the area that feeds a river is what's known as a watershed, or a drainage basin, where all the water that falls within this area eventually ends up in the same place. However, sometimes when mountains arrange themselves in a certain way, all routes to the ocean can be blocked off, and water has no choice but to stay where it is. These are called endorheic basins. As it just so happens, the Rocky Mountains have produced a massive internal watershed in the form of the Great Basin. Thousands of years ago, during the last ice age, when more moisture reached the area, the basin captured enough water to fill a lake, producing the ginormous Lake Bonneville. In the far more arid climate of the present, however, the lake has been reduced down to only its deepest section, the Great Salt Lake, leaving the rest of the basin as the largest of the country's 4 deserts. While its size means that the Great Basin Desert spans several states from Wyoming, Utah, and Idaho all the way into Oregon and California, and even into parts of Mexico, Nevada is the only state that sits almost entirely within the basin.
Yeah.
What this means for Nevada is that the majority of it lacks access to water, and without water, you can't have anything. That's why before 1940, Nevada was by far the least populous state in the country, with only 110,000 people, a trend that only changed due to the state's decision to legalize gambling, which led it to become the fastest growing state from 1940 all the way until 2000.
How ironic is it now they've just got water spraying in the air?
3.
That's
Filling
funny,
the
man.
state with millions of residents crowded into the few places where there is water. But as Nevada remains one of the fastest growing states in the country, it'll only suffer more and more from extreme water shortages and will have to compete against California for water rights. Looking for a reason as to why such a state would end up being created in the first place, we can actually thank the American Civil War again. As the Republicans rushed to ensure Lincoln would win the election, Nevada was admitted to the Union just 8 days before the election, despite it at the time having only a little over 10,000 residents, far below the 60,000 people typically required for statehood. In fact, politicians were so hell-bent on making Nevada a state that it originally looked like this. In this form, the state wouldn't even have had access to the Colorado River and Lake Mead, meaning no Las Vegas and 80% of Nevada's population. While the state's absorption of part of the Arizona territory was definitely an improvement, gaining the state access to the water from Lake Mead, the rest of the state's poor access to water continues to cripple its ability to grow beyond Vegas.
How do you live in other areas? Is it like, is there still abilities to get little bits of water here or there, or is it literally like you live off bottled? Obviously, because you have to shower and stuff, you have to have baths, you have to like wash up and all these different things. I don't really know the sciences behind it, but do they just have to build pipes from all the way from where Las Vegas is and like the rivers are? I forget what the river was called that you just mentioned. Or like how? I don't really know how it would work. Like people who live right in the middle of Nevada. I mean, I guess it's very, very rare for people to live there, but there's obviously like small communities here and there. Like, how do they get by, man? Ogallala, never heard of it.
The last example I have doesn't relate to a single state, but rather several of them. See, if you're familiar with the geography of this country, you'll be aware that there are a number of states in the middle of it that are basically all the same. Specifically, I'm talking about Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska, Iowa, South Dakota, North Dakota, and let's be honest, a lot more. All of these states occupy the Great Plains region, where the once sprawling grasslands have created some of the best lands for agriculture in the world. In turn, these lands have been transformed into a corridor of continuous farming, an agrarian powerhouse within the country. This all begs the
Bro, these are the most typical American things, man. These red barns. You can't get more American than that, man. You just can't. All you need now is just a big USA flag. Where is it, though? I mean, it's probably hidden away in the trees or somewhere.
within the country. This all begs the
American
question, though, why have multiple states to govern what's essentially a single area? After all, state governments are expensive to run, meaning breaking an area like this up into many smaller states only forces residents to pay more in taxes for the same thing. On top of this, having multiple governments makes cooperation between states far more difficult and decisive actions less possible than would be in a single state, which just so happens to be necessary for an industry like agriculture, where regional land management plays a big role in your economy. Remember, this is where the Dust Bowl happened, precisely because of poor land management, and we can see this becoming an issue again today with the draining of the Ogallala Aquifer. What is the Ogallala Aquifer, you ask? Simply put, before this was all farmland, over time a large amount of water was absorbed by the soil here, storing it beneath the ground in what's essentially a huge underground lake. Ever since World War II, large-scale agricultural operations have been extracting this water for use in crop irrigation, making possible much of the production that comes out of this region. This transformed a huge part of the country from a dry and grassy landscape, what we'd call prairie, into acres upon acres of cornfields at the expense of slowly draining the aquifer. Falling under the borders of 8 different states, management of this resource requires a lot of cooperation between competing interests, which means cooperation doesn't really happen. You see, as a public resource, each individual state benefits economically, at least in the short term, by extracting as much water as possible for growing food, even if that means eventually there will be no water left. This type of scenario is taught in every high school environmental science class as the tragedy of the commons, and can only be combated by regulation from a higher authority, which in this case means the federal government telling a bunch of states what to do, which if you know anything about America, you know is hard and doesn't always work. But if it were the responsibility of fewer states, maybe even just one, with the understanding that their economy wholly relied on agriculture, all of a sudden the whole issue falls onto a single entity to fix. You no longer have a situation where a state like Texas, which has a far more diverse economy than any other state occupying the prairie, has relied heavily on groundwater for irrigation, and as a result has experienced some of the most drastic drops in the level of the aquifer anywhere in the region. The thing is, once the aquifer dries up here, Texas has the rest of its economy to fall back on, while the rest of the states that depend far more on farming could be destroyed by a sharp drop in production. Predictions for how much longer we'll be able to continue pulling water out of the aquifer span from 20 years to only 10 more years, and action needs to be taken soon to avoid this. Again, these borders were drawn before we knew any of this, but now we know better and we might have to start acting on this knowledge. After all, what would be the purpose of preserving these state lines if it meant everyone—
What is this? What are these white things? What the hell is this? I'm so confused.
in the states will be out of a job and have to move in a matter of years? Trust me, last time something put
This is
thousands
just farmland, isn't it?
of farmers out of jobs here, we saw nearly 2.5 million people abandon states like Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, and Nebraska, fleeing to states like California, and the country as a whole entered the worst economic period in its entire history. Overall, what I hope I've convinced you of is at the very least the possibility that the borders we have right now might not be the best, and it could be beneficial to begin rethinking some of them. So finally, let's take a look at what some improved borders might actually look like. Perhaps the most common place for the United States to be compared against is Europe. This, for a lot of reasons, makes sense to do, not only because of our shared histories and cultures, but also in a geographical sense. These two places have a lot in common. Measuring 9.8 million square kilometers, the United States very nearly equals the 10.1 million square kilometers Europe covers, which by extension ends up making America's 50 subdivisions of comparable sizes to the 44 countries of Europe. But here's the problem. Europe has a population of 746 million people, while the United States sits with only 330 million, meaning that here in Europe, more than twice the number of people have fit themselves into fewer sovereign states. So, while many European countries are of comparable sizes to many United States, the same definitely cannot be said about their populations. Texas, for example, the second biggest state, measures bigger than Europe's second largest country, though Ukraine still
I didn't even know Ukraine was the second largest country in Europe. I didn't even know
contains 44 million people, or 15 million more than Texas. France, which I never realized until now is Europe's third largest country, is only slightly bigger than our third, California, but holds a population nearly 20 million greater. The same holds true if we look at other large countries like China, which has only 33 major subdivisions despite having 1.4 billion people, India with 36 subdivisions while having 1.3 billion people, or even Africa, which has 54 countries for a total population of 1.2 billion. All of this points to the possibility that the United States may in fact have too many states. So, sticking with Europe as a baseline for now, a simple proportion of its population over subdivisions shows us that around 20 states would be adequate for a country with 330 million people. Now, let's be clear, there are an infinite number of ways you can make 20 states out of 50, and everyone is going to have a different opinion on the best way to do this. Initially, what I wanted to do was simply take a map of the 50 existing states and just combine neighboring states until only 20 were left. But I'll be honest, I actually did this. I chose what states to keep and which ones to merge. I calculated the new state populations, the new state areas, and even wrote a little about each new state I ended up creating, which took me about a day's work. The reason it took me so long is because I kept running into the same issue, where no matter how you combine states, you're still always going to have these long, unapologetic straight lines that just don't take any of their surroundings into consideration. And so the result of combining states is always more or less a bunch of states that still suffer from the same issues as before. So I decided to scrap that whole portion of the script altogether. Instead, over the course of my research for this video, I stumbled upon a 20-state arrangement that the US actually already uses, courtesy of the United States Geological Survey, that appears to remedy many of the specific.
So you've got Hawaii, Alaska, California, Great Basin, Pacific Northwest, Upper Colorado, Lower Colorado, Rio Grande, Missouri, Southwest Red Rainy, Upper Mississippi, Arkansas White Red, Texas Gulf, Lower Mississippi Caribbean, South Atlantic Gulf, Tennessee, Ohio, Great Lakes, Mid-Atlantic, New England.
Problems I brought up a minute ago. You may or may not have noticed that a lot of the troubles I went over dealt with the allocation of water resources, so it comes as little surprise that the map that spoke out to me was one showing the water resource regions of the country, which totally ignore current state boundaries to focus on the real hydrological units that constitute the land, creating each state around essentially a single drainage area. Dividing the country like this has a number of benefits. First, each state comes equipped with its own natural transportation routes to serve as the primary avenues to access the interior of a state. This also gives each state complete control over their water resources, or in other words, each state achieves full water sovereignty and is no longer dependent on management from multiple states or borrowing water from neighboring states. Looking more closely, we'll find what used to be Nevada and Utah have been replaced with the Great Basin, a state defined by its sheer lack of water. While this might sound like a horrible idea, what this would allow the state to do is adapt more appropriate water management regulations, such as banning uses of water not related to human survival. This means no watering your lawn for green grasses in the middle of a desert, no water parks, no golf courses, and most importantly, no irrigation-intensive agriculture. While banning most forms of farming across an entire state might seem extreme, with a setup like this, the purpose of each state would become far more clear, and agriculture would become the duty of other states with much more access to water, like those of the Midwest.
Okay, I'm going to leave it there. This is a really, really good video, man. The next part's going to be shorter, and I'm not going to read the comments just because of that. And again, I'm going to post a reaction. If you watch this as soon as it's been posted, I'm going to post it within an hour or two. It's either or, I don't know yet. But if you're watching this reaction when it's not been posted, and maybe like a day after, both parts are already up. And I mean, I'm going to react to it straight after I pause this one, because this is really damn interesting. But yeah, hopefully you enjoyed this part. Again, this channel is really, really good. And again, I said again a lot there. Suggest some more videos like this from this channel, please, because I'm really enjoying these kinds of videos from this channel, man. It's like the geography mix of everything, like agriculture, all these different aspects of things that I didn't even know were going on in the US. There's obviously a lot of, like, maybe not worries, but like possibilities that could go wrong, especially in this kind of area. I was really surprised about that, and the Great Basin as well, to be honest. And West Virginia too. There's a lot going on, man. But yeah, hopefully you enjoy this one. Part 2 will be up soon. Next time, like, subscribe.